Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we're undertaking a very specific mission. We're looking at a memoir called Sissy, a coming-of-gender story by Jacob Tobia.
Right.
But right out of the gate, I need to be incredibly clear with you about what this deep dive is, and probably more importantly, what it isn't.
I think that framing is crucial here.
Yeah, because we are not here to do a standard book review. We aren't here to critique the prose or the narrative pacing or character arcs. And critically, we are not here to engage in some kind of cultural identity debate.
No, definitely not.
Our goal today is strictly an institutional systems analysis. We're basing this entirely on the observations provided in the source material.
We're basically treating this life story as a sociological case study.
Exactly. So for you listening, we're going to look at the machinery behind the story.
And the primary system under examination today is what we can call the gender norm reinforcement system.
Okay, define that for us.
Well, when we use that term, we are looking at a highly distributed, just deeply interconnected network. It encompasses the family unit, the educational system, peer groups.
Media consumption.
Yes, media consumption, and overarching cultural expectations. All of these nodes work in tandem to reward conformity to a very specific set of rules. And conversely, to punish or discourage deviation from those rules.
It's a mechanism of social engineering.
It is, and it operates largely in the background of our daily lives. So the goal today is to bring that machinery out of the dark and examine its moving parts.
Right. Think about the invisible structures you navigate every single day, the things you don't even, question anymore. So to really help you visualize how this mechanism operates, we're going to trace this system through its entire life cycle.
The full arc.
The full arc. We'll look at the design, meaning how the system is actually built. We'll examine the incentives, the social economics driving our participation. We'll look at the outcomes, how this shapes human identity. We'll explore its persistence, the institutional feedback loops keeping it running.
And finally, interconnection.
Right. How this specific system hooks into broader structures like our workplaces and the economy.
No.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the architecture itself.
The design phase.
Yeah, because when we talk about the design of a binary classification system, my mind immediately goes to, laws or government mandates.
Yeah.
Or official rule books.
Which is a common misconception.
But the reality presented here in the text is much more insidious, isn't it?
It is, because the most crucial thing to understand about the design of this system is that it does not rely on formal, centralized, top-down policy to function.
Right.
There is no official government manual being handed out to citizens dictating exactly how gender must be performed on a Tuesday afternoon.
No one's checking your gender license at the grocery store.
Exactly. Instead, the concept of normal is operationalized through distributed daily interactions. It is essentially crowdsourced.
Crowdsourced, I like that.
And the author's own childhood serves as a primary case study for this. We see a really stark contrast established early on between two different microenvironments, Tobia's own home and the home of a neighbor, Mrs. Bullock.
Oh, let's hover on Mrs. Bullock's house for a moment.
Yeah.
Because it completely rewired how I think about childhood environments. The source material describes her home essentially as this magical sanctuary. But from a systems perspective, it's really a laboratory.
A laboratory is the perfect word for it.
Right, because Tobia was a very feminine child. And at Mrs. Bullock's house, they were allowed to just exist without any structural enforcement.
Complete freedom of expression.
We're talking putting on tutus, decorating cookies with bright pink sprinkles, trying on Mrs. Bullock's high heels, even painting their nails blue and being allowed to keep that polish on for a full 24 hours.
Right.
And what strikes me there is the absence of something. Mrs. Bullock wasn't throwing a parade for gender nonconformity.
She simply wasn't policing it.
Exactly. She affirmed the child's behavior by just not reacting to it as if it were a glitch in the matrix.
And that absence of policing is what makes it a laboratory. In an environment without enforcement mechanisms, human expression naturally diversifies. A child will simply gravitate toward whatever brings them joy or color or sensory satisfaction.
But then you contrast that with Tobia's own parents.
Yes, and that contrast reveals the actual architecture of the system.
And we should clarify, the parents were not violently abusive.
No, not at all. They were not cruel, cartoonish villains, yet they functioned as the primary enforcement mechanism of the system's design.
That is the part that I think will resonate, or maybe sting, for a lot of people listening. You don't have to be abusive to be an enforcer.
You just have to be a participant in the culture.
Right. The parents were just navigating their own immense pressure. Society demands that you raise a quote-unquote normal boy.
Yeah.
If you don't, society questions your fitness as a parent. So the parents have to draw behavioral boundaries.
But the currency they use to draw those boundaries is microscopic.
Microscopic. Unpack that for me.
We have to analyze that currency carefully. For a highly observant, emotionally intelligent child, overt discipline isn't necessary. The enforcement currency was simply the slightest look of disappointment when the child reached for the wrong item in the dress-up bin.
Or a subtle hesitation.
Exactly, an almost imperceptible hesitancy when asked for a Barbie for Christmas.
I want to ask you about the psychological weight of that, because a slight hesitation seems like nothing. It's a fraction of a second.
To an adult, maybe?
Right, so how does a fraction of a second become a foundational building block of a societal system?
Because you have to multiply that hesitation by millions of interactions over the developmental arc of a childhood.
Wow, millions!
Yes. A child's primary biological imperative is to secure the attachment and approval of their caregivers. Their survival literally depends on it.
So they're hyper-tuned to those signals.
Completely. So when a child reads that subtle cue, that sigh, that tightened jaw, that brief pause before saying, okay, they instantly realize they have stepped outside the acceptable parameters of the design.
They register the threat to their social safety.
And they course correct to regain equilibrium. It's a distributed network of behavioral nudges that eventually builds a massive, invisible wall.
And the child builds the wall themselves, eventually. They internalize the sigh so the parent doesn't even have to do it anymore.
Self-policing is the ultimate goal of the system.
But where does the blueprint for this wall actually come from? Like, how do we justify putting people into these two incredibly rigid boxes in the first place? The source material points directly to how we educate kids about their bodies, which I found fascinating.
The foundation of this classification system is deeply tied to early anatomical education.
The euphemisms.
Right. Parents often use euphemisms. The book mentions the common practice of using words like wee-wee or pee-pee for everyone, regardless of their anatomy.
Which, on its face, seems completely harmless, and actually it has a radically gender-neutral potential.
How so?
Well, if every toddler has a wee-wee, then every toddler is starting from the exact same baseline.
That is the neutral starting point, yes. But the system immediately takes that neutral vocabulary and injects a rigid classification onto it.
It splits them.
It splits them. The child is taught not basic biology, but what functions as a mythology.
Mythology.
They are taught that these body parts are fundamentally vastly different and that this difference dictates their entire trajectory in life.
The mythology aspect is wild to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Kids are taught you have this specific part, and therefore you are in a completely different category from the kid sitting next to you.
Correct.
But the why is completely skipped over. No one ever sits a 4-year-old down and maps out the biological mechanics of why a specific physical appendage magically dictates a preference for the color pink.
Or a desire to play with a plastic doll versus a plastic truck.
Right, because those mechanics do not exist.
There is no biological tether between genitalia and a preference for a specific wavelength of light, like pink or blue.
Obviously.
But the system relies on this mythological explanation to stabilize the categories. It creates a foundational binary classification system.
It is the ultimate because I said so, baked into the child's understanding of their own flesh.
That's a great way to put it. And once that foundational division is accepted as a law of nature, the rest of the societal architecture, the differing expectations, the clothes, the behavioral standards, it can all be built securely on top of it.
Okay, so we have this passive design. We have these subtle cues of disappointment, and we have this foundational mythology about bodies. But a passive design needs active operators to keep it running.
It needs enforcement.
Exactly. How do the participants actually learn to enforce the rules on each other? That brings us to the next phase of the system's life cycle. Incentives.
The economics of conformity and social safety.
Right. I want you, the listener, to picture your elementary school playground. Think about the social dynamics there. The source material uses the moment Tobia's older brother enters elementary school to illustrate a massive shift.
This represents a critical pivot in the system's operational strategy.
When children enter elementary school, they step into an environment of increasing independence.
They are away from the constant, direct supervision of their parents for the first time.
And in that newly forming social hierarchy, children take the task of gender policing upon themselves.
The system is essentially brought home from the schoolyard.
Yes. Suddenly, for Tobia, being a feminine boy, went from being a quirky family dynamic that required subtle parental nudging to an outright social crime enforced by a sibling.
And this is where the word sissy enters the narrative.
It's described as a scarlet letter. It was actually the very first gender identity Tobia ever had, long before concepts like gay or trans or non-binary were ever introduced or understood.
It was a word imparted with immense crushing shame.
But I have to ask, why do kids do this to each other? What is the systemic incentive for a first or second grader who barely understands the world to suddenly become a rigid, ruthless enforcer of gender norms against their own sibling?
It comes down to establishing social power and mitigating personal risk.
Risk management for 7-year-olds.
Exactly. In these independent social environments, conformity is heavily rewarded. If you perform your assigned gender role correctly, the system pays you in the currency of belonging, predictability, and social status.
You are deemed safe.
You are safe. Deviation, however, carries the immense cost of exclusion, bullying, and ostracization. Therefore, individuals, even very young children, are incentivized to actively participate in enforcing the rules on others.
Because pointing out someone else's deviation turns the spotlight away from you?
Precisely. It temporarily lowers their own exposure to scrutiny. By calling someone else a sissy, the brother proves his loyalty to the system.
He's showing his badge.
He demonstrates to his peers that he knows the rules, he abides by the rules, and he is willing to police the rules. It is a performance of compliance.
It's essentially a protection racket. You participate in the policing to prove you belong to the in-group and buy your own safety.
It's highly effective.
And there's a story in the material that demonstrates this enforcement mechanism perfectly, though it masquerades as something entirely different. It's the story of the Miss St. Francis pageant.
A pivotal moment.
Picture a church youth group. Tobia's in middle school and decides to enter this pageant, which traditionally is just an excuse for older, macho, high school boys to dress up in drag as a joke.
Right.
But Tobia takes it seriously. Instead of acting grotesque or clumsy, Tobia acts elegant. They sing a song beautifully and earnestly, and they actually end up winning the pageant.
On the surface, if you just look at the outcome, it seems like a massive triumph.
Right. Tobia beats the older, cooler high school seniors and gains immediate social credibility among peers. The peers view the middle schooler as bold, daring, and deeply comfortable in her masculinity for being quote-unquote ballsy enough to wear a dress in front of an audience.
But the feeling of victory didn't last.
And the systemic analysis of why it didn't last is chilling. Walk us through the actual trap that was sprung in that church sanctuary.
What's fascinating here is that the pageant wasn't a celebration of gender nonconformity, even if Tobia managed to subvert it momentarily.
It was a trap.
The pageant itself was an institutionalized mechanism of mockery. The system utilizes parodic spectacles, like older, masculine boys acting clumsy, hairy, and grotesque while wearing dresses, to deliberately manufacture shame around femininity.
So when the audience laughed at those older boys,
That laughter served a deeply structural purpose.
every laugh in that room is basically a warning shot. It's the collective saying, look how ridiculous this is. Don't ever try this in real life.
It is the ultimate warning shot. Laughter in that context isn't joy. It's a boundary being drawn in real time. It signals to the collective that femininity in a male body is inherently ridiculous, a joke, a performance to be laughed at and then discarded before returning to normal behavior.
So while Tobia temporarily felt accepted, the systemic outcome was that the boundaries of acceptable behavior were drawn even tighter.
It narrowed the behavioral range for every single boy sitting in those pews. It heavily incentivized all of them to distance themselves from anything resembling genuine femininity, lest they become the actual target of that laughter, rather than the comedic beneficiary of it.
The pageant reinforces the idea that you can only touch femininity if you are actively disrespecting it.
Exactly. That is the only permitted interaction.
But the material also shows that these rigid systems aren't perfectly sealed. Human beings are incredibly resourceful, and they find workarounds.
We always look for the loopholes.
There's a fascinating loophole Tobia discovers in middle school, which is referred to as gender mushiness.
Right, the onset of puberty.
When puberty hits and the boys suddenly want to kiss the girls, the entire social dynamic shifts. Because Tobia already understood how to talk to girls, having been best friends with girls before the system forcibly separated everyone by gender in elementary school. Tobia's skills suddenly became a highly valuable, marketable social commodity among the straight boys.
This is a classic example of how individuals navigate and survive rigid incentive structures when they cannot outright defeat them.
They find the gaps.
They find the loopholes. Under the aegis of heterosexuality, the strict segregation of the genders had to soften slightly because the boys needed access to the girls.
Right.
Tobia stepped into the role of a gender seer, a bridge builder, by utilizing their proximity to straight male desires, essentially acting as a consultant for boys trying to navigate female psychology. Tobia was able to safely bypass the usual systemic punishments.
It's a brilliant instinctual survival strategy. It gave Tobia unfettered access to femininity again. They could hang out with girls, reconnect with their childhood best friend Paige, and exist in feminine spaces, all under the protective cover of being the straight boy's reconnaissance scout.
It temporarily lowered their exposure to the system's scrutiny because they were providing a service to the dominant power structure.
But we also have to look at the other boys in this scenario.
We do. We must examine the darker side of the incentives driving male socialization during this exact same period. The process of becoming a man, as observed in the case study, relies on deeply harmful incentive structures.
It's rooted in the practice of violence.
Violence, the endurance of physical pain, and the systemic violation of consent.
The imagery used here is visceral. Kids shooting airsoft guns at each other. Specifically, a boy asking, "Can I shoot you?" Hearing the other person clearly say no and then shooting them anyway.
Framed as child's play.
Right. Just boys being boys. But what is actually happening there systematically?
That is an active training ground for the system. It incentivizes ignoring boundaries.
So
They learn that dominance is rewarded. The boy who cheats after hearing no is practicing dominance. The boy who is shot is learning that his boundaries do not matter in the face of masculine assertiveness.
the system stigmatizes weakness to maintain cohesion within the hierarchy.
You are rewarded for inflicting pain, and you are rewarded for silently enduring it. If you complain, you lose status.
Think about the long-term damage of that. What happens to a person's identity when they spend their entire childhood suppressing their boundaries just to survive the system?
It shapes them permanently.
And that transitions us perfectly into the third stage of our analysis, outcomes. We've seen how the design works. We've seen the incentives driving the behavior. Now, what is the human cost? What is the product the system generates regarding identity formation and trauma?
The book uses a phenomenal analogy here to describe gender-based trauma.
It's not compared to a broken leg, it is compared to a bad back.
This distinction between acute trauma and cumulative trauma is vital for a systems-level analysis.
Right, because a broken leg is undeniable.
It is a sudden, acute event. You stop walking, you go to the hospital, you get a cast, and society immediately recognizes your injury. The system accommodates your recovery. You get time off, people sign your cast. The need for healing is visible and culturally validated.
But a bad back. You don't get a bad back from one catastrophic event. You get it from decades of minuscule damage.
Sleeping on a terrible mattress for 10 years.
Carrying a heavy bag on one shoulder every single day. Sitting with bad posture at a desk, adjusting how you sit just slightly to avoid a weird look from a boss. It goes completely unnoticed for years. You just think, oh, I'm a little stiff today.
Until one day you are in chronic, debilitating pain and your entire skeletal structure has been compromised.
That is how the outcome of the gender norm reinforcement system is described. It is a lifetime of microscopic stress.
The outcome of this repeated daily reinforcement is that it fundamentally shapes long-term identity development. It forces individuals to constantly manage and suppress an internalized shame.
And here's the kicker.
What is particularly illuminating about this analysis is the assertion that this outcome is not unique to transgender or gender nonconforming individuals. The system's rigidity ensures that every boy and every girl struggles with this bad back.
Wait, I really want to emphasize that point. It's easy for someone listening to think, well, I'm cisgender, I fit the norm, this system works for me, I don't have a bad back. But the material explicitly argues against that, doesn't it?
It does. It posits that every boy, no matter how conventionally masculine, and every girl, no matter how conventionally feminine, struggles to fit the impossible ideals dictated by the system.
The rigid scripts constrain absolutely everyone's behavioral range.
The trauma of having to constantly monitor your behavior, suppress your emotions, or alter your presentation to avoid social penalty is universal. The intensity and the system's punitive response certainly vary depending on how far you deviate from the center, but the mechanism of control applies to everyone.
Your social spine is completely warped, regardless of where you sit on the spectrum.
Yes.
Building on these outcomes, I want to look at how this system interacts with those who openly challenge it or try to transition out of their assigned category. The source material talks about the classical trans narrative.
A very specific script.
Right. Even when the system seemingly allows for deviation or transition, it strictly dictates the terms of that surrender.
Correct. It demands a highly curated narrative. To be accepted by the mainstream, the system basically hands you a required script.
And to be a rebel's hard against this script. Because the system demands that your story features absolute consistency. You have to say, I always knew I was a girl, or I always knew I was a boy.
There can be no fluidity.
It demands that you view your physical body as the ultimate enemy, the dragon that must be slayed. It demands that your story be centered almost entirely on deep, agonizing trauma. And finally, the climax of the story, the ultimate reward, must be that you perfectly assimilate back into the binary system.
You pass.
You pass. You become normal again, just on the other side of the wall.
This raises an important question. Why does institutional control demand this specific narrative? Why do cisgender media gatekeepers, editors, and producers heavily favor and elevate this specific story over others?
I think it's because it's the only narrative that leaves the overarching binary classification system intact.
Precisely. It comforts them. It protects their worldview. If a trans person suffers immensely, hates their body, and then utilizes medical intervention to perfectly align with traditional binary expectations, the system itself is validated. The binary is reinforced as the natural, desired end state of human existence. The individual may have changed sides, but the wall between the two sides remains fortified.
By demanding this specific story, the system absorbs the threat and neutralizes it. It strips away all the messy, ambiguous, and joyful realities of human gender evolution. It demands the gender be taken incredibly seriously at all times.
There is no room for humor.
No room for fluidity. No room for someone who just wants to wear a beard and lipstick at the same time and not have it be a tragic medical emergency. By forcing these stories to conform to the binary, the system silences the very voices that could actually liberate everyone from the bad back we just talked about.
Having established the design, the incentives, and the outcomes, we must now look at the fourth stage of our analysis: persistence.
How does this system sustain itself so effectively over time? How does it survive cultural shifts and individual challenges?
It does so through powerful institutional feedback loops.
And to illustrate this, the source material provides a brilliant juxtaposition between two physical environments during Tobia's college years. First, a pre-orientation backpacking trip in the Pisgah National Forest.
A critical contrast.
Out there in the woods, something incredible happens. Gender just seemingly evaporates.
Without walls, without gendered bathrooms, without the physical architecture of society, the social architecture collapsed too.
What we are observing in that forest is what happens when you remove the institutional design. Without the environmental triggers and the structural reinforcement mechanisms, the incentive to police gender disappears.
The group dynamics completely shifted. They didn't cater to the strongest, most stereotypically masculine hiker. They calibrated their pace to the weakest hiker.
Right.
The social hierarchy, previously based on gender dominance, was entirely replaced by an imperative of mutual care and basic survival. Human beings defaulted to
But then, the trip ends. They return to the physical campus of Duke University, and the contrast is jarring. It perfectly illustrates institutional persistence.
the return to civilization.
Tobia gets to campus and immediately realizes the system is baked into the literal bricks of the buildings.
The dorms are entirely gender segregated.
Right. Tobia realizes they cannot even perform basic human functions like brushing their teeth, taking a shower, or going to sleep without being forcibly classified and treated as a man by the institution. You are literally funneled into a room based on a binary classification,
And then you have the Greek rush process.
which forces the entire freshman class into a strict totalizing binary. You are either in the salmon shorts rushing a fraternity, or you are in the white dress rushing a sorority. There is no in-between. Let's map out how this feedback loop actually functions.
Institutions, whether a university, a corporation, or a government, will often cite tradition or biological necessity to justify their structural policies. These policies, such as segregated dormitories or binary social organizations, act as a forcing function. They compel the student body to conform to the binary.
Because if you don't conform, you don't get a room, and you don't get a social life.
Exactly. Because everyone is forced to conform to access basic resources, visible deviation and conflict are drastically lowered.
Everyone just complies to survive.
And this resulting uniformity is then pointed to by the institution as proof that the binary is entirely natural and universal. They say, look, everyone fits neatly into these two categories, therefore our policies are correct.
It is a perfectly sealed, self-perpetuating loop. The institution creates the condition, enforces the condition, and then uses the result as evidence that the condition is natural.
It's a rigged game.
And the material gives us another darkly hilarious example of how institutions force people to contort themselves to fit these loops. It's the story of the college admissions essay, which I think anyone who has ever had to apply for a job or a school will painfully relate to.
This is a profound example of institutional demands on marginalized identities, often operating under the guise of progressivism.
So Tobia goes to Governor's School over the summer, this program for nerdy, artsy high schoolers. They decide this is the safe testing ground to wear high heels in public for the first time. They do it, and it's this powerful, painful, incredibly illuminating experience of walking across campus in stilettos.
A huge personal milestone.
But when it comes time to write a college admissions essay about it, Tobia realizes they can't just tell the truth.
The raw reality of the experience is not what the institution wants to consume.
No, they couldn't just write, "I wore heels because they made my legs look incredibly sexy and I felt a surge of raw power." That wouldn't appease the institutional gatekeepers reading the applications.
To be granted entry into the elite institution, the experience had to be sanitized and repackaged into systemic jargon.
Tobia had to write a highly academic, arguably dry essay about how wearing high heels was a deliberate intellectual exercise in breaking down their own masculine privilege in order to further the broader cause of diversity.
It was a total snooze fest.
But it worked. Why does the system require that sanitization?
Because it requires marginalized people to translate their raw, lived existence, their joy, their fashion, their identity, their messiness into acceptable, non-threatening academic concepts.
Make it palatable.
You can be different, the institution says, but only if you use our approved vocabulary to explain how your difference benefits the institution's diversity metrics. It turns personal liberation into institutional PR.
It consumes the identity without ever having to actually accommodate the reality of the person. Which brings us seamlessly to our final analytical stage, interconnection.
How does this specific system link up with broader structures?
Exactly. How does this gender norm reinforcement system link up with seemingly unrelated societal structures? The source material makes a direct, powerful connection to the economic system and the workplace through the concept of professionalism.
Think about your own workplace for a second.
Right. The dress code, the acceptable topics of conversation, the way you are expected to style your hair. Tobia experiences the weaponization of this concept firsthand during an internship at the United Nations in New York.
A global diplomatic institution.
They have these amazing Hillary Clinton pumps, but they realize very quickly they have to hide them under their desk. They can only put them on late at night when the office is empty and the quote-unquote professionals have gone home.
So what does this all mean? Why does a pair of shoes threaten a global diplomatic institution?
Because professionalism is not a neutral, objective standard of workplace decorum.
The author explicitly argues that it is a highly loaded, interconnected enforcement tool. It operates as a seemingly objective standard that actually masks and enforces racism, sexism, heteronormativity, and trans exclusion.
When you look at how this plays out across different demographics in a corporate office, it's striking. Think about the double standards. You have Black employees being told their natural hair is unprofessional, forcing them to alter it to fit a white standard just to be taken seriously in a meeting.
You have non-Christians navigating an environment where it's professional to ignore their own religious holidays while the office puts up a giant Christmas tree in the lobby.
You have women navigating this impossible tightrope of being attractive, wearing makeup, wearing heels, but not too attractive, lest they be deemed inappropriate.
And for trans and gender nonconforming people, being professional simply means hiding your identity entirely if it doesn't conform to the dominant norm.
You have to put your identity away, quite literally under the desk, to be viewed as competent. This reveals that the gender reinforcement system is not isolated. It is the exact same machinery used by economic institutions to maintain a specific demographic hierarchy.
If you control the definition professional, you control who gets the promotion. You control who has access to economic stability and upward mobility.
And that leads to another massive systemic fallacy tackled in the text, the myth of earning nonconformity. I found the section on the Rhodes Scholar fixation incredibly revealing.
It exposes the false promise of meritocracy within a rigid system.
Tobia admits to being completely obsessed with becoming a Rhodes Scholar. Part of the inspiration was Rachel Maddow, who was a Rhodes Scholar and became this dapper, successful, queer icon. But Tobia realizes they had this subconscious mantra running in their head. If I just get the Rhodes, No one will ever be able to tell me to take off my lipstick or my skirt ever again.
They believed they could essentially buy their way out of the system's punishments with ultimate academic prestige.
It's the idea that if you just become undeniable, the rules will stop applying to you.
But that is a critical structural fallacy. As Tobia realizes, no amount of privilege earns you the right to be gender nonconforming. The system's design is absolute across all socioeconomic levels.
Achieving the pinnacle of academic or financial success might provide you with resources.
It might buy you access to specialized healthcare, or a safer neighborhood, or legal protection. But it fundamentally does not shield you from the systemic shame, stigma, and corrective pressure that the system continuously outputs.
The rules apply everywhere, even in the halls of Oxford. You can't out-achieve the system. The bad back follows you into the boardroom.
It does.
And that leads to a really hard truth about who is actually keeping this system running. It's not just the active bullies. It's not just the kid shooting the airsoft gun or the guy shouting slurs from a car window. It's the passive beneficiaries.
The structural analysis here is razor sharp. When a playing field is deeply uneven by design, you do not have to be a maliciously bad person to benefit from it.
A straight, cisgender man does not need to actively engage in homophobia or transphobia to profit from the system.
He doesn't have to lift a finger.
Because the institutional machinery naturally privileges him, all he has to do is put his name in the ring and stay perfectly quiet.
By remaining neutral in the face of these power structures, he allows the system to walk all over those who are different, while he passively reaps the rewards of reduced competition and institutional favor.
Isolating gender as just a personal, individual squabble completely obscures this massive structural advantage.
Yeah.
It lets the beneficiaries pretend they just won a fair race.
Which is exactly why the narrative arc concludes with an act of highly visible public defiance.
Tobia decides to run across the Brooklyn Bridge in stilettos.
Yeah.
A whopping 1.1 miles, jogging in sky-high heels. And yes, it was technically a fundraiser for a charity, but standing at the starting line, it became about so much more.
It was a necessary systemic rejection, a rejection of what is termed masculine respectability politics.
It was Tobia realizing there is no manual for how to be a gender nonconforming adult in the real world. You can't politely ask the system for space. You can't write a neat little diversity essay and hope the institution grants you permission to exist.
You have to take the space.
The run across the bridge was an explosion of identity. Glitter and confetti into a world that demands rigid, quiet professionalism. It was a physical demonstration of surviving and navigating the architecture on their own terms.
Having traced this entire system from its subtle design in a childhood living room, through the incentives of the playground, to the outcomes of identity formation, and finally to its economic interconnections in the workplace, it is time we pull the lens back.
We must ask the central question of our analysis today.
Yes.
I want to pose this directly to you, the listener. Think about the subtle hesitations you've felt, the jokes you've laughed at, the professional codes you've adhered to. Based on the systems we've unpacked, what is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is multifaceted. First, we misperceive that our discomfort or society's confusion around gender nonconformity is simply a personal individual reaction, or merely a private ideological disagreement.
That is the surface interpretation.
What that surface interpretation completely obscures is a massive distributed structural layer. We fail to see the invisible machinery, the architecture of families, schools, media, and workplaces that actively and continuously shapes human expression through subtle incentive structures rather than overt centralized force.
When we rely on surface interpretation, we fall back on thought-terminating cliches like boys will be boys or girls will be girls.
We fail to realize that this behavioral enforcement is incremental, it is socially rewarded, and it is entirely normalized across every single institution we interact with.
A systems-level analysis changes our visibility entirely.
By identifying the initial design, by mapping the incentive architecture, and by exposing the institutional feedback loops, we stop attributing social outcomes to isolated, quirky personalities. We stop diagnosing gender variance as a biological anomaly to be cured.
Instead, we finally start seeing the active working machinery that curates, restricts, and polices human expression on a global scale.
That is the structural clarity we gain.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Consider the physical spaces you will move through tomorrow: your office, your gym, your local grocery store. I want you to look around and ask yourself how the physical architecture and the unwritten social rules of those specific spaces are actively maintaining the bad back of gender expectations for you, regardless of how you identify. Where is the system subtly nudging you into conformity right now?
It's a question worth asking every day.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.